Before you start augmenting and amplifying and scaling learning through AI, you really need to understand the basics, the fundamentals of what learning is, and all the variables that go into what we call a learning experience, right? I call it the right foundation, the right fundamentals. You can come up with another term, but let's really try to understand how people learn. And once we have this learning framework, we can augment that. And AI is amazing at that because AI makes us bigger and better and faster and more efficient, but it's all about efficiencies, right? How about effectiveness, right? Or efficacy? Is it really making us more effective? So that's where I come in, right? And I would say, let's not be AI first, let's be science first, or I should say learning science first. So that's pretty much the big idea.
Dom, I'm so excited that you're here today. It's been great to get to know you since I met you at the Zillow Exchange event. I know you think a lot about learning science, and I'm so excited to learn from you.
Well, thank you for having me, Vince. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. I know that you're currently writing this paper with a pretty punchy title, Science First, AI Second. I know you have very strong views on how to bring good learning design. Let me start by asking, what's the big idea here that you're writing about? And what sparked you to write this?
So I wouldn't really call it punchy, but if you think it is punchy, then I'll take it. It is a little bit provocative. I'll give you that because it's science first, AI second. Now, in this world where we're being bombarded with AI, right? I feel like everything is and everyone is AI first, AI forward, right? And then everything else is second or last, right? So from that perspective, it might be punchy. But the whole idea is that before you start augmenting and amplifying and scaling learning through AI, you really need to understand the basics, the fundamentals of what learning is, and all the variables that go into what we call a learning experience, right? I call it the right foundation, the right fundamentals. You can come up with another term, but let's really try to understand how people learn. And once we have this learning framework, we can augment that. And AI is amazing at that because AI makes us bigger and better and faster and more efficient, but it's all about efficiencies, right? How about effectiveness, right? Or efficacy? Like, is it really making us more effective? So that's where I come in, right? And I would say, let's not be AI first, let's be science first, or I should say learning science first. And so that's pretty much the big idea of the paper, Vince.
I suspect you're sort of responding to the fact that in this AI frenzy, science is sort of not being fully accounted for and in fact getting left a little bit behind. And we see a lot of like gimmicky use of AI in many ways in the learning field. I would love to hear the top 3 learning science principles that really work and which ones you see L&D teams frequently forget about in their work.
Yeah, so let me reply to your first sentence. You said that we're kind of augmenting and scaling gimmicky things. And I like to cite Donald Clark, a friend of mine, and I am such a huge fan of Donald. He once put something so elegantly. He said something like, lawyers know the law, engineers know physics, but learning professionals know little to nothing about learning science. Isn't that interesting, right? You wouldn't want someone who's just passionate about the brain and neurology to operate on your brain or on your mother's brain or your son's brain, right? You would want someone who's actually practiced for years. So why don't we do the same in our learning profession? It's really interesting. It's kind of ironic. When it comes to learning science, there's so many variables that play a role when it comes to learning, right? Learning is, first of all the physiological stuff, right? The circadian rhythms, your sleep patterns. Are you sleeping enough? Are you getting enough rest, right? Are you drinking enough water? You know, the water intake, hydration is important. The food that you eat is important, right? Stress and how you manage your stress, all the physiological things. Like, let's put that aside, and it's not trivial, Vince, as you know, all that really matters when it comes to learning. But let's put that aside and let's just look at the cognitive stuff, right? The way our attention works, the way our memory works, for example. And we don't have sort of like an all-encompassing theory of learning. So it's still pretty elusive to say that we have a learning theory. But, you know, here's the but. In the past, almost like, I want to say like 150 years, different fields, different sciences, I should say, have come up with so much evidence on how learning really proceeds in the brain/mind. what learning is. So we have a lot of evidence on how our attention works and what limits our attention and what sustained attention, how sustained attention is dependent on a bunch of factors. We know a lot about memory and, think about something like the very basic forgetting curve. Have you heard of the forgetting curve? You've probably heard of that, right? We kind of throw that now. It's become more mainstream than like 10, 15 years ago. We've known about the forgetting curve since 1885. Ebbinghaus, the German psychologist, kind of tested himself. He was like his own test subject, right? And he came up with this idea that human memory is valuable and we really forget most of the things that we hear. In his case, it was nonsense syllables that he tested. So things that we hear, things that we read. But we also know that we forget everything else. Like it could be any other stimulus, things we hear, things we touch, things we read, etc. Right? So we have so much evidence. So I would say if you press me on the top 3 learning principles, I would say number 1 is definitely self-quizzing. Research has shown over and over and over again that if you learn through quizzing, you've heard of Duolingo, right? Why is Duolingo so popular? Duolingo doesn't say, Dom, here's your French lesson, and they teach you how to form the past tense of the verbs. They throw you into this environment where you have to speak and press on things, and you gotta practice through quizzing. So it's this constant quizzing. In the corporate environment, learners might not be self-aware, so they wouldn't be, creating their own quizzes. So that's where learning design comes into the picture. So the learning designers have to make sure that a huge piece of that learning experience has to be quizzing. In our jargon, we call it formative quizzing. So it's not just summative quizzing, like you go through a course and then at the end of the course, you have maybe a little quiz, a little knowledge check, right? Yeah. At the end of the module, at the end of the course, at the end of the day. Instead of doing that's summative quizzes, you do formative quizzes. So you learn something for 5, 10, 15 minutes and you're quizzed. And then you might start a learning lesson with a hook, right? So that novelty thing that the brain is kind of craving and looking for, right? I give you like a very sensational, sexy title for the video and I show you a 5-minute video. And then what happens usually? We forget about the video. We might have a debrief and off we go to the next section. So 1.1 was the video, 1.2 is the next section. No, you don't do that. You instantly throw in a quiz. And then after the quiz, it might be 5, 6, 7, 8 questions. And after the quiz, you go to the next section, which might be a social collaborative activity and a canvas like Mural and even Sparkwise, for example, right? And then what happens in a typical curriculum? You forget about it and you start with the next topic. No, you don't do that. You should do another quiz. So you see, my team calls it constant quizzing, but research has shown self-quizzing is the most effective learning and by extension teaching technique. And a lot of this research is coming from Dunlowski's lab. Dunlowski has been researching this for, I want to say like a couple of decades at least. In the last 12, 15 years, Dunlowski and his colleagues have been telling us that this is the most effective teaching technique or learning and by extension teaching technique. Yet the surprising fact is most of the time in our curricula, there's no quizzing. There might be some summative quizzing, right? The second one, again, coming from the same folks, the same researchers, Dunlowski and his colleagues, is spaced repetition, right? Just because our memories are so valuable and we forget most of what we hear and see and touch. By the way, Ebbinghaus in 1885, I think he said we forget about 75% within 24 hours. Imagine within the 24-hour period, we forget as much as 75%, right? And there were a lot of critiques about that work because he used nonsense syllables and it might have not been like the best controlled experiment. But research after research has shown that it is around 60 to 70%. So, who cares if it's 60 or 65 or 70? Between 60 and 75% is simply forgotten. So how do you capture that in a learning design, right? When you're building a learning experience or learning experiences, right? Psychologists call it spaced retrieval. And the whole idea is just when the learners are about to forget something, you nudge them. You don't need to repeat the whole module or the whole session, right? But you give them like the most critical ideas, like you give them bullet points, you give them a little quiz, right? So if you think of a forgetting curve, right, which is really like, if you think of retention, right? So retention goes like this. It's like sort of like a U curve, right? You're retaining less and less and less and less and less. So the forgetting work would be just the opposite, right? You're forgetting more and more and more. So when you're about to forget something, you nudge them and you cut that forgetting curve and you're really influencing it positively so it gets prolonged. So the whole idea is instead of repeating that again after a day, that remains in your memory for another 2 or 3 days. So the next repetition should be 3 days later and not, again within 24 hours. So what you're doing is you're really postponing and delaying the nudges, right? From the content perspective. And you're really delaying those periods of time. So your second repetition has to be within, 3 to 4 days. And then your third one could be like 2 weeks later. It's usually like around 10 to 12 days, whatever, right? There's different models, but you get the idea, right? So psychologists call it space retrieval. So I retrieve the information from the memory because it might be still there, like lurking, right, in your brain, but you haven't used it. You haven't retrieved it from the memory. You might have completely forgotten it, but it might be still there, sort of like lurking in your memory systems. And then you nudge them. So that's the second one. And the third one, I need to make a decision. Let me think. So Dunlowski would say the meta-cognitive techniques, and there's a bunch of them. He specifies one that's called elaborative interrogation. The whole idea is very simple, right? It's almost like, have you seen like Young Sheldon, the Young Sheldon show? Because he's always asking his mom and dad, like, why? Why do we do this? Why do we say this? Why did you say this, right? Whenever I hear and I think about elaborative interrogation, I think of the Young Sheldon, right? So you learn something and then you start asking questions you start asking questions yourself. You're going, why does this matter? Does this really matter for me? How am I going to use this? Why does this make sense? Or why does this not make sense, right? So it's this, you're constantly interrogating yourself, and it's called elaborative interrogation because you're interrogating yourself through this elaboration, right? You really want to elaborate on the facts, on what you just heard. So that's one of them. Self-reflection is another one, but these are like some of the meta-cognitive techniques that have been shown over and over again to be sort of like they're not like the gold star winners. They're not like the top 2 or 3, but maybe like they would probably deserve like the 4th or 5th spot. That's another one that's really, really popular out there, again, in educational psychology, and hasn't really permeated into professional L&D space.
That resonates a lot, especially because a lot of the techniques that you talk about, like we use the word active learning at Sparkwise. One of our co-founders used to work at Minerva, which is also very big on active learning. But it's all calling on similar threads, right? Which is that you got to get the brain to actually grapple with the content and get it to like try to recall stuff that it looked at and like really like work with it rather than just passively consume. And I feel like L&D focuses on delivering as much content as possible in like as streamlined way as possible, which actually defeats the purpose of what you're saying, which is you gotta like get the brain to work. Like it needs to exert effort, but like we're trying so hard to make it easy, and it's almost like going against like how.
Yeah, it's almost like counterintuitive, right? What we're doing. There's another one that I'm a huge fan of. It's called interleaving, and it makes zero sense if you read about it, if you try to understand it. And interleaving is really like instead of teaching any kind of topic or subject going from A to B to C to D to E, like a regular flow, which is what every single teacher and professor and trainer and facilitator wants to do. Because it's just like, this is how we've been taught and we just want order and structure, right? But research after research has shown that if you mix up different topics and subjects, the recall, the retention is actually higher. Instead of going from A to B to C to D to E, you're going from A to B. And then instead of going to C, you repeat A, then you go to D and E, and you might repeat B, right? So the best combination is interleaving and spacing. That will give you so much more retention than anything else. But it's so counterintuitive, Vince. And I love that you mentioned active reading, because there's another technique that's really, really been shown. It's much older though, because this is probably from the 70s and 80s. It's called the generation effect. Have you heard of the generation effect? So the whole idea was, and this was like cognitive psychology in the 70s. I believe it came out in 78. And it was really popularized in the early 80s. The idea is if you actually generate something, if you recite something or sing something or summarize something or say things out loud, your retention rate goes up versus you're just listening to it or just reading it. You're just hearing it or reading it, right? So you're actively involved in that learning process. So this whole active learning field that was, born in the 80s and it was really popular in the 90s and early 2000s, it really comes from that, this whole idea of a generation effect. And it's one of our biases. This is one of our memory biases. They're called cognitive biases. And it's really, really big. If you just hear it, if you just read it, you're not going to remember that as much as, versus if you actually did something, if you acted something out, Bob Pike passed away, I think last year or the year before. He was a huge proponent of active learning. He called it participant-centered learning or learner-centered learning, right? The whole idea was that the learners they have to do something. And they would do these crazy things. They would say, okay, here's a really cool video. Then they would debrief a video. And then they would say, stand up and touch XYZ. And you would have like all these posters on the walls and people would have to touch something. Or they would say, grab your learning partner, and after you touched ABC, then explain to your learning partner what that is. You see what they're doing? They're not just making learners sort of like these passive absorbers, just absorbing the information that the trainer, the teacher is conveying, but they're actually making them do things, whether it's touching things, explaining things. In the digital world, you can imagine you can do some dragging and dropping, and you can maybe move things around. Maybe you can answer short questions. But this whole active learning comes from one of the most researched cognitive biases, which is the generation effect, right? So That's another one. I've already given you 5 now. I could talk about this forever because I'm so excited about this. But really, the whole idea is once you have the basis down, the framework, the foundations of what really makes people learn, like what really makes learning stick, to use like sort of like a modern analogy, right? We want learning to be sticky. We want learning experiences to be sticky. We want learning to stick. And once you have that, then I'll say, go and use AI till you drop dead. This is where you should really use AI and amplify and augment and scale these things, because this is what AI is really, really good at. And we should really leverage AI for that. But don't augment, you call them gimmicky things. In my paper, I mentioned someone bragging about this the other day on LinkedIn. He said, I came up with an amazing prompt XYZ that captures all the learning styles. I'm just going, learning styles have been debunked over and over and over and over again. People just don't stop talking about them. But here's what we're doing now. We're augmenting that through AI, and AI will do that, and AI might say, hey, by the way, learning styles have been debunked. They don't exist. But especially earlier large language models from 2-3 years ago, they weren't that good and they wouldn't really call that out. They would still augment and amplify everything learning styles related, right? So that's what I mean. The whole idea, again, of that paper was to really call out on augmenting and amplifying things that are not scientific, that haven't been proven scientifically, that haven't been proven empirically. They're just our gut feelings, a lot of things that we have created in our learning space that are not really scientific. They're not empirical. They haven't really been tested. That's pretty much what I've been researching and kind of talking about for the past years.
I know you write about this concept of Mindset-Skillset-Toolset as well. Can you talk a little bit more about what does that mean in your mind, and how are you putting that into practice in your organization?
Because of my fancy schmancy title, my title is Global Head of Learning, Innovation, and Technology. People would come to me back then when ChatGPT came out, and everyone was saying, Dom, how can we leverage ChatGPT? How can we use large language models? How are you leveraging AI? And I still get this, Vince, from a lot of learning professionals and a lot of professional forums on LinkedIn, etc., and podcasts. People are saying, how are you leveraging AI? I think it's the wrong question. We're asking the wrong question. The question is, how are you solving business problems by using AI in L&D? So this is what I usually say. I read this paper in the Harvard Business Review years ago, and it was on Mindset-Skillset-Toolset, and it was about innovation in different organizations. The whole premise of that paper was companies want to be innovative, but they're not really innovative because they think they're going to be innovative through skills and technology. But they should really start with the mindset. And it's really like, what is your view of innovation? Like, what is your worldview of innovation? What is your philosophy about innovation? How can you do that, right? So I kind of borrowed that idea and I've kind of pivoted to learning and development. So I always say, don't go to the technologies. Don't go after technology. Don't be tech forward or tech first. Let's start with the mindset. And I'm kind of harping on this, and people are now, it's sort of like an internal joke. As Dom always says, mindset, skill set, tool set, right? And it's really about, let's think about what learning is. Let's think about how people learn. All the stuff that we already touched at the beginning of this podcast, right? What is learning? What are the variables? How do people really learn? What is the ecosystem for learning that we're going after, right? Part of the mindset shift is also, getting rid of all those preconceived notions of learning, like all the pyramids, the circles, the cycles that have never been proven scientifically, right? All the famous dangerous pyramids, how people have misinterpreted them, right? I want to say it's really thinking deep about what a learning experience is and what goes into a learning experience. And then at the same time, it's this mentality of constant, I would say, continuous improvement. We need to keep pushing the envelope, keep reading about how the mind works because, believe it or not, every single week we learn another thing or two about how our memory works. If you're subscribed to like neuroscience news, it's a newsletter that comes out every single day and there's a weekly summary. It's just amazing. Like researchers found a certain group of neurons that is part of the long-term memory process, for example, right? Or it's implicated in the long-term memory process. We're learning about the brain so much, right? So it's really important to be constantly reading, to be like updated. So that's all part of the mindset piece, Vince. And then there's the skill set. Once you've gotten the mindset down, then you need to start thinking, okay, so what does my team need to know? Like from the skills perspective, L&D is usually tasked with upskilling and reskilling the entire organization. And I've been saying for years now that we need to focus on ourselves first. It's like when you're flying, put your oxygen mask on you first before attending others. It's really like that, So we are on this major journey at TTEC, reskilling and upskilling like pretty much every single person in L&D. And our L&D is massive, by the way. It's got more than 700 team members. We have a reskilling program for the trainers. We have an upskilling training program for the instructional and conversational designers. We have an upskilling program for the leaders, all around AI and data literacy and financial acumen, a lot of stuff. The skilling piece is really important for L&D. I'm really referring to L&D first before attending others, namely other units. And then last but not least, the famous tool set. So it's mindset, skill set, tool set. Yes, tools are important. Yes, we need the tools. Tools are usually the nice, beautiful, sexy, shiny objects that everyone goes after. But I'm saying they're great and they can augment and, amplify what we're doing. And they can definitely bring in a lot of efficiency. But hey, we need to be after efficacy as well, not just efficiency. And this is where I usually say, I hear this all the time. I go out to these L&D conferences and people will say, so how do you go about picking a new LMS? How do you go about picking a new training delivery tool? And most advice is get what you need. I really don't like that advice, Vince. It is driving me crazy because I keep hearing get what you need for your business. And I say, no, you get what works. You need to get the technology that really makes learning stick. So if it's an adaptive learning system that is based on how the brain learns and acquires information and retains information, that's what you need. You don't want to go after the bells and whistles of a beautiful Facebook-looking learning experience platform that's not going to get you to that stickiness, right, that we want. I'm really tired of hearing get what your business needs. So look, I understand it is important to understand your company's architecture and infrastructure. It's important to minimize friction in your ecosystem, in your tech stack. It's also important that you need to minimize the number of integrations that you need among these systems. I get that. So yes, integrations are important. The architecture, the company's architecture and infrastructure are important. But when it really comes down to choosing the technology, selecting the right vendor, the right technologies, it's go after what makes learning stick. Like really, what is going to bring you to that behavioral change change, if you will, which in turn is going to impact business performance. I heard the other day that we have 700 LMSs out there. There's 700 LMSs out there. I guarantee 95% of them have not thought about this. Oh, let's build a piece of software that really makes learning stick. That's usually an afterthought, right? It's not something they would start with. So I put in my paper that learning professionals know very little about learning theory, but people who are building learning technology know even less, which is a huge problem. These chief learning officers and other learning professionals are trying to select the right vendor. They don't know the theory. The vendors are trying to teach them because let's be honest, most of the trends on learning technology are coming from the vendors, right? Not from the learning practitioners. It's their job. So I understand we need them, right? Because they do the job for us. But at the end of the day, we need to be super critical when it comes to vendor selection. We need to be super critical and really understand what learning is before we start augmenting that through any kind of technology. That's why I always say toolset is last. Last, but not least. But it's really important. But let's not start with the tools. Let's start with the mindset first.
I love that. And yes, I agree with everything you said. And the best sort of the clients that we work with have very clear desire and understanding of what effective learning should look like and are like deploying technologies in a thoughtful, integrated way to bring that impact. So yeah, 100%. So let's actually dive into some examples of what you're doing at TTEC with some of these mindsets, skill sets, and tool sets in place. I'm curious, when it comes to AI, what are the two big ways in which you brought AI into the organizations to really augment what's effective?
Yeah. So once we had the framework, and we call it the learning framework at TTEC, it's just a one pager. It has 4 little sections on what each and every learning experience should be like, right? And we like to say that it has to be emotionally stimulating. It's got to be visually pleasant. It's got to have practice, not just any kind of practice. It's got to be distributed, spaced, personalized, real world simulated practice. We have like all these different pieces. But again, this is based on 150 years of research into learning and learning experience, right? So once you have that, and for us, this is sort of like, my team likes to call it the mother document. It really just summarizes all the foundation, if you will, of learning sciences. I'm not saying this is all that we know. There's a bunch of other things that we would have included, but just we wanted to simplify it. And like we asked ourselves, if we could only live with like 5 or 6 things from learning sciences, what would it be? So that's the mindset piece, right? We got that one, check. When we came to the skill set piece, we said, okay, so now we need to upskill our instructional designers, our learning innovation technology specialists, so they really understand the learning science. So we came up with the upskilling program. And then from the technology perspective, we are using one of our examples. You asked me for a couple. I'm going to give you a couple of them. But the first one I'm very, very proud of is using a proprietary knowledge graph with the RAG functionality and proprietary bespoke advanced prompting. But it uses just a general out-of-the-box full stack AI in Writer. It was a big deal when this came out a couple of months ago. Writer ran, our use case, and we were like all over the media for that. We simply used their platform and their large language model capability, but we built our own knowledge graph around learning science. And we also built over 50 different prompts on how each learning experience should be designed and developed. So we called it the curriculum wizard, and it became a sensation overnight. It was affectionately called the curriculum wizard because we thought it really does magic. It really does magic on the back end. So we feed it with the 50 plus prompts that I mentioned earlier. And we say, can you design this for me? Design that for me. And we really start sort of like high level with the curriculum structure. We say, build the curriculum structure for me. Build the whole learning journey. And not only that, we will ask the bot to give us the script for every single activity, every single quiz, every single video, everything completely designed. It's not multimodal, Vince, since we can't create videos in that platform, but we get everything is text-based. But once we have all the foundation, the text-based pieces, we develop things in other platforms, whether it's speech-to-text platforms or video platforms, other multimedia platforms, including, like basic authoring tools like Rise and Articulate, etc. That learning design process used to take about 3 to 4 weeks on average. It could take all the way up to like 8 or 12 weeks, but on average at TTEC, it was around 4 weeks. And now it only takes like literally one afternoon. And then if you add the human oversight on top of that, human in the loop, which is always needed, it might be 2 to 3 days. So you can have the whole curriculum built out in 3 days versus 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks before. But we didn't stop there. We added another wizard called Discovery Wizard, because we realized that in order to do really good design, you need to do a really good analysis or needs assessment, right? So we kind of piggybacked on the manual process that our solutioning team was doing. And that process, Vince, was also a week and a half to 2 weeks to really figure out what the client needs. We had this idea on my team. Could we come up with another magician, another wizard? And we called it the Discovery Wizard. So the Discovery Wizard now works. It is so beautifully connected. There's a proprietary bespoke intake form. So you jump on a call with a client or an SME. It could be, anyone who's a stakeholder, and you just like literally ask questions. And there's a bunch of questions on the intake form, and you just say, yes, the curriculum has this, it doesn't have that. This is the type of practice they have, blah, blah, blah. There's like, over 40 different questions. And once you filled out the intake form, you put that in the knowledge graph, and you basically say to the Discovery Wizard, okay, based on this information, what should we focus on from the learning perspective? What is already there in the curriculum, because the client might already have a curriculum, and what is missing? And it gives you this awesome, really detailed output on these are the good things that the curriculum has. These are the missing pieces. And this is what instructional design should really focus on. So it gives you that. So that output serves as the input for the curriculum wizard. And then the curriculum wizard will do its magic and come up with the entire curriculum, with the entire learning journey. It's a multi-day learning journey with all the activities. But what's the catch? The beautiful thing, the most beautiful thing, Vince, here is that it's embedded and it's grounded in learning science. So it's got every single thing you can imagine around memory and attention, right? And distribution and frequency or spacing of practice and, multimodal experiences. It's going to tell you this should be a video. This should not be a video. It's going to say this should be a quiz, and it should be repeated on days 1, 3, 7, 12. It gives you all that, which, you're going to laugh. We used to do that manually. And I would ask my team, I would say, well, you need to insert the quiz based on the forgetting curve. So they would have the forgetting curve in Excel sheet and say, okay, I'm going to put this on day 1 in the curriculum and day 7 and day 14. Right? 1, 3, 7, 14. There'll be a better learning progression. So, and we laugh so much now because that whole end-to-end design process, which used to take about 6 to 8 weeks, now takes, without the human in the loop, it only takes about an hour, less than an hour. But if you add, the revisions and the, human oversight, it might extend to 2 to 3 days, perhaps 4 days. But we're not talking weeks. We're talking hours. Right.
Like 90% sort of reduction in length of time.
We usually say it's 70 to 80%. And we've done a lot of time in motion studies, right? Depending on what part of the workflow, some parts of workflow are 90% shorter, faster. Some parts are 30, 40%. It just depends on the complexity of the curriculum, on the vertical. It depends on the complexity of the content, etc. Right? Is it human experience skills versus very technical skills? Does it involve system training, right? Because we do a lot of system training. Our product is people who talk and service the customers. So they need to talk, and they also need to use a bunch of systems. So this is like the nature of our work, of our people's work. That is an example of an AI-enabled learning design suite. We call it the Learning Wizard. The Learning Wizard Suite, it's called. Yeah. There's another wizard, and I can give you this as another example. So, how we always say learning has to be skills-based, and practice has to be skills-based, and content has to be tagged for skills. But most people don't think skills. They might have, maybe HR people think skills when it comes to bigger enterprise level, enterprise-wide initiatives. But if it's like something very technical, a technical piece of training, very, very rarely will you get the skills. So we've added that into the intake form, and we would ask the client, have you mapped out the skills that really move the needle on the business when it comes to the business metrics? And a lot of times, well, 99% of the time, they'll say no. So we will say, guess what? We have a solution for you. Just tell us what you want to measure from the business perspective. Is it an average handle time, AHT? You want to measure net promoter score, NPS, first call resolution, FCR? Tell us what you need to measure. Tell us what business outcomes you need to drive, and we will run that through our taxonomy wizard. And the taxonomy wizard comes back with the taxonomy that has discrete skills with tangible behaviors for each and every business metric. And it does that through a single prompt. Well, there's a couple of prompts that we add on top of that now to make it even more specific. But let's say with 2 or 3 prompts, you can get the accuracy rate is around 97, 98% without a human in the loop. And you get discrete skills and all the behaviors for each and every metric. And you go back to the stakeholders and you say, don't worry if you don't have the skills. I got them for you. Voila, here they are. They came from our taxonomy wizard. So the taxonomy wizard can also work in tandem with the discovery wizard. So that is fed into the curriculum wizard. So the 3 magicians together are beautifully synchronized. So if you think about doing the end-to-end analysis, solutioning, design, development process, if you think of that workflow, that whole thing is done like literally in a couple of hours, right? So that, but again, there's so much science behind that. There's so much science around the human habits and the science of practice and attention and memory and spacing, etc. I am super proud of my team, super proud of what we've achieved. But that's a great example of, Mindset-Skillset-Toolset approach that you asked me about. And also a great example of how you are, or I should say, we are amplifying and scaling something that really makes learning stick, something that really drives knowledge retention, and ultimately behavior change. And we don't even stop there. We measure everything. We go to the 4th level of Kirkpatrick and we measure the business impact. How did we impact the most important business metrics for that account? It's so beautifully connected into this wizard's ecosystem. That's a great example of how AI is augmenting science, right? Again, science first, AI second.
Yeah. Dom, I love such a good example of using AI not to just create a whole bunch of content and only focus on efficiency, but also do it in an effective way. Thanks so much for sharing. I have so many more questions, but I realize that for today's conversation, I should pause it here, but I'm looking forward to continuing this and for you to share your experience with the broader world as you publish this paper and more.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought we have a few more minutes, but I like that you're keeping that short. So, people's sustained attention is going down. So I think it's better to have something shorter. Yeah. But yeah, look, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Vince. We've had many discussions around this, and look, we could have a follow-up session, like volume 2, science first, AI second. Yeah.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.